I think she's probably been put in there because, according to Donald Trump, she's a 10.
In a fiery exchange on The View, Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, found herself at the center of the heated debate with co-hosts Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar. Leavitt's inaugural press briefing included a statement that drew sharp criticism. She announced the administration's stance against wokeness and its impact on federal policies. Goldberg, visibly upset, responded passionately, emphasizing the historical significance of wokeness in advancing civil rights and gender equality. Behar added fuel to the fire by suggesting Leavitt's appointment was based on her appearance rather than qualification. This confrontation highlights the ongoing tensions surrounding the concept of wokeness and its implication in contemporary politics. Stance on wokeness. Karoline Leavitt's first appearance as White House press secretary set a clear tone for the administration's stance on what it sees as the excesses of modern progressive ideology. Her direct reference to ending funding for transgenderism and wokeness across federal agencies signaled a decisive shift in federal priorities. The language used was deliberate, aimed at drawing a line between the administration's approach and the previous era's focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. By framing wokeness as an obstacle to efficiency and traditional values, Leavitt is reinforcing a broader conservative critique that sees such policies as ideological rather than practical. For this administration, merit and personal responsibility are now the guiding principles for evaluating both government programs and the individuals who serve within them. The implication is that DEI frameworks are perceived to prioritize identity over competence, which the administration argues can compromise institutional performance and fairness. Leavitt's stance also resonates with a significant portion of the Republican base, which has grown increasingly skeptical of DEI efforts, viewing them as politically motivated and divisive. Her remarks suggest that the administration intends not only to scale back these programs, but also to actively reshape the conversation around equity in public service. This includes re-evaluating federal training programs, hiring practices, and agency mandates that were influenced by past DEI directives. The move reflects a broader ideological pivot, one that prioritizes a return to what is characterized as neutral governance, free from cultural or identity-based considerations. In doing so, Leavitt and the administration are setting up a contrast with their political opponents, framing themselves as advocates of common sense and traditional American values. Her first briefing, thus, wasn't just a policy signal, but a cultural one, placing the administration squarely in opposition to what it defines as progressive overreach in federal institutions. Whoopi Goldberg's response. Whoopi Goldberg's response to Karoline Leavitt's comments carried the weight of lived experience and historical awareness. Speaking from a platform shaped by decades of cultural commentary and activism, Goldberg framed wokeness not as a buzzword or political pejorative, but as a legacy of resistance and progress. For her, it signifies awareness of injustice, of exclusion, and of the long fight to correct institutional inequities. By linking the term to the civil rights struggles of the 20th century, Goldberg underscored its deeper meaning beyond current political debates. She emphasized that many of the opportunities available to women, people of color, and other marginalized communities were not simply handed down through neutral systems of merit, but were hard-won through activism, protest, and policy change. In that context, the push for wokeness has been a call to acknowledge and address systemic barriers rather than a departure from fairness. Goldberg's reaction highlights the generational divide in how such terms are understood. What younger conservatives may see as ideological overreach, many in older progressive circles view as the fruit of necessary and ongoing work toward justice. Goldberg's critique of Leavitt's remarks also pointed to the risk of erasing or minimizing historical progress. To her, rejecting wokeness wholesale is not just a political stance, it's a denial of the very efforts that opened doors for previously excluded groups. This framing reframes the debate not as one over bureaucracy or efficiency, but as a broader cultural reckoning with how America chooses to remember and respond to its history of inequality. By invoking a historical lens, Goldberg challenged the notion that DEI policies and woke initiatives are recent inventions. Instead, she portrayed them as modern extensions of a much older and nobler effort to create a more inclusive and equitable society. In doing so, she positioned herself as a voice not only of dissent, but of continuity with the past struggles for civil rights. Joy Behar's controversial remark. Joy Behar's remarks about Karoline Leavitt's appointment sparked intense debate, not only for their content but for what they revealed about double standards in political commentary. By implying that Leavitt was chosen primarily for her appearance, Behar entered dangerous territory, accusations that often target women in the public eye and diminish their accomplishments. Her comment, seen by many as dismissive and personal, quickly drew criticism from both conservative and liberal voices, many of whom pointed out the irony of using a gendered critique in the context of defending progressive values. The backlash was swift. Critics labeled the statement as sexist, arguing that it reduced Leavitt's qualifications to superficial traits and ignored her professional record. Leavitt's supporters highlighted her roles as communications director for high-profile members of Congress and as a national spokesperson for Donald Trump's 2020 campaign. These experiences, they argued, clearly positioned her as more than capable of handling the demands of the press secretary role, regardless of political affiliation. Behar's comment also fueled a broader conversation about the selective application of feminist principles. While she has long been an advocate for women's rights, critics noted that such advocacy rings hollow when it's not applied evenly across political lines. In this case, many felt that Behar's critique mirrored the very kind of objectification and dismissal that feminism seeks to challenge. Some saw it as emblematic of a broader trend in political discourse, where personal attacks often overshadow policy debates and professional records. Supporters of Leavitt also pointed out that Behar's remark inadvertently gave fuel to conservative narratives about media bias and the hypocrisy of liberal commentators. In attempting to discredit Leavitt, the comment instead shifted attention away from substantive disagreements over policy and ideology, placing the spotlight on tone and decorum. As the controversy unfolded, it became clear that debates around representation, merit, and professionalism remain as fraught as ever, especially when viewed through a partisan lens. Election integrity. The discussion on election integrity turned into one of the most explosive segments of the entire exchange. Karoline Leavitt, known for her firm stance on voting laws, didn't hesitate to confront the narrative head-on when Whoopi Goldberg accused Republicans of trying to suppress votes. Whoopi pointed to Georgia's controversial voting legislation as a prime example, claiming it was designed to make it harder for people, particularly minorities, to cast their ballots. But Karoline came fully prepared, firing back with clarity and confidence. The Georgia law, she stated emphatically, expands early voting, adds security to absentee ballots, and requires ID, something 80% of Americans support. That's not suppression, that's common sense. Her tone was calm but firm, and it immediately shifted the energy in the room. Whoopi attempted to cut in, but Karoline wasn't backing down. Leavitt didn't just defend the law, she flipped the script. She accused liberals of hypocrisy, bringing up Stacey Abrams' refusal to concede after her 2018 loss in Georgia. "You're fear-mongering," Karoline snapped. "And let's not forget, when Stacey Abrams lost in 2018, she spent years claiming the election was stolen. But when Republicans say the same thing, it's treason?" That line alone sucked the air out of the studio. The audience let out a collective gasp, and for once even Joy Behar was speechless. What made Karoline's rebuttal so powerful wasn't just the content, it was the delivery. She anticipated the attacks, armed herself with statistics and facts, and turned the tables in real time. In just a few sentences, she challenged the double standard that's dominated election discourse for years. She reminded viewers that election skepticism isn't unique to one party. Democrats questioned election results in 2000, 2004, and 2016, Yet it's only when Republicans raise concerns that the accusations of undermining democracy get loud. Leavitt's response wasn't just a defense, it was a full-on offensive move, and the impact was undeniable. The fiery exchange showcased her media savvy and her readiness to spar with political heavyweights. In a setting where conservatives often feel ganged up on, Karoline didn't just hold her ground, she dominated it. Whoopi's personal jab backfires. As the debate heated up and policy points began slipping from Whoopi Goldberg's grasp, she pivoted to a more personal line of attack, one that ended up backfiring in real time. With a dismissive tone and a hint of condescension, Whoopi looked Karoline Leavitt straight in the eye and asked, "Karoline, how old are you again? Maybe you should do a little more living before lecturing people who've been in this fight for decades." It was a risky play, a transparent attempt to diminish Leavitt's credibility based solely on her youth. But instead of flinching, Karoline held her composure with impressive poise. She leaned into the moment, responding with a smile that said she saw the jab coming a mile away. "Age doesn't equal wisdom," she fired back, "and repeating the same tired narratives for 30 years doesn't make them true. I represent the next generation, and we're tired of being told to sit down and shut up." The room erupted. Even those who weren't on Karoline's side couldn't help but react to the sheer confidence and clarity of her response. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a generational mic drop. In a space where conservatives are often boxed in or drowned out, Leavitt's words broke through like a thunderclap. Online, the reaction was just as fierce. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded X and TikTok, racking up millions of views. Hashtags like #Karoline owned the view and #Whoopi got served began trending as users from across the political spectrum weighed in on what they saw as a turning point in the conversation. What stood out wasn't just that Karoline defended herself, it's that she did so without descending into pettiness. She turned an insult into an opportunity, flipping the narrative from being too young to know anything to being bold enough to challenge decades of stale political talking points. It was a statement of defiance, not just against Whoopi, but against an entire media culture that often discounts younger voices. Whoopi's attempt to put Karoline in her place didn't just fail. It gave Leavitt the perfect setup for one of the most talked-about moments of the entire show, the race card. As tensions escalated, Whoopi Goldberg resorted to one of the most well-worn strategies in her playbook, accusing the Republican Party of promoting coded racism and pandering to white grievance politics. It was a familiar line of attack, often used to shut down conservative viewpoints before they can fully take root in the conversation. But this time, it didn't land. Karoline Leavitt refused to flinch. She didn't raise her voice or get defensive. Instead, she addressed the accusation head-on with calm, composed logic. "That's a dangerous and lazy accusation," she said, her voice steady. "You're reducing complex policy debates to identity politics. We want border security, law and order, and economic opportunity for all Americans, regardless of race." The air shifted instantly. Her response didn't just reject the premise, it challenged the entire framework of Whoopi's argument. Rather than getting entangled in a no-win rhetorical trap, Karoline turned the conversation toward policy, substance, and the real-life consequences of failed governance. Then came the blow that landed hardest. "Maybe instead of calling everything racist," Karoline said, "we should talk about real issues affecting minorities, like failing schools in Democrat-run cities or skyrocketing crime." That single line reframed the entire conversation. The audience went silent for a beat, sensing the weight of what had just been said. Whoopi was visibly stunned, momentarily caught off guard by the clarity and force of Karoline's retort. Even Sunny Hostin, normally quick to jump in with reinforcement, stumbled in an attempt to pivot the discussion elsewhere. Karoline's move wasn't just bold, it was strategic. She refused to let the conversation get derailed by race-baiting tactics that oversimplify complex national problems. Instead, she brought attention to measurable, real-world struggles happening in communities across America, particularly in urban centers run by Democratic leadership for decades. It was a powerful moment, not just because it silenced the usual narrative, but because it exposed the superficiality of the accusations so often lobbed at the GOP. Leavitt didn't just deflect, she redirected. And in doing so, she forced the panel to reckon with a truth they rarely confront on air: that shouting racism doesn't solve the problems facing real people. This wasn't a debate win, it was a dismantling audience reaction. For years, the studio audience of The View has served as an echo chamber of progressive applause, a comfortable space for liberal perspectives to dominate unchallenged. But on this particular day, something radically different unfolded. As Karoline Leavitt delivered her arguments with precision, calmness, and undeniable conviction, the expected rhythm of boos and groans was replaced by something far more surprising: applause. What started as a few hesitant claps quickly snowballed. Nods of agreement spread through the crowd. People weren't just listening, they were resonating. Viewers both in the studio and online witnessed a live cultural shift, a moment where ideology took a back seat to authenticity. Karoline didn't pander, she didn't grandstand. She spoke directly, factually, and fearlessly. And that honesty landed. This wasn't the usual cable news sparring match. Karoline wasn't there to play games. Her tone was firm but respectful, passionate without being theatrical. She dismantled arguments not with insults but with uncomfortable truths, and the audience felt that. Her message cut through the noise, and for perhaps the first time in a long while, the crowd was willing to hear a different side. Clips of the exchange exploded across social media platforms. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok lit up with reactions. Conservative influencers called it a cultural reset, praising Karoline for her clarity and composure. But the response didn't stop there. Even politically neutral viewers, people who might have tuned in for background noise, were taken aback by the shift in energy. It wasn't about left or right anymore, it was about who came to the table with truth and who was left grasping at straws. Meanwhile, Whoopi Goldberg, typically the unshakable anchor of The View, seemed visibly rattled. She attempted to pivot the conversation, interrupt, and redirect, but the control she normally wielded so effortlessly began to slip. Each time Karoline spoke, it became clearer that this wasn't going to be a typical segment where the token conservative got steamrolled. Instead, Whoopi found herself on the defensive, forced to grapple with a guest who refused to be intimidated. The moment was more than viral, it was historic. It captured a subtle but undeniable cultural shift. People are craving honesty, not talking points. And on that day in that studio, they got exactly what they didn't expect. This is why Americans don't trust you. As the tension peaked and the segment drew to a close, Whoopi Goldberg made one last attempt to steer the conversation back in her favor. With her trademark dismissiveness, she fired off a condescending remark: "Don't come on here pretending like you've got all the answers." It was a classic View tactic: shut down the guest with a quip, deflate their momentum, and move on. But Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch. In fact, she leaned in. "I'm not pretending," she said, her voice steady. "I'm telling the truth. And the truth is, this show is part of the problem. You dismiss opposing voices, mock half the country, and act shocked when people don't trust the media anymore. This right here, is why Americans are tuning you out." The reaction was immediate and unforgettable. The audience, which had been growing increasingly engaged throughout the segment, froze. No clapping, no laughter, no defensive shouting, just a wall of stunned silence, as if someone had yanked the air out of the room. Even the hosts, so often armed with quips and canned outrage, were caught off guard. For once, no one had a response. It was the kind of moment that doesn't need to be exaggerated or dramatized. It was the drama. A simple, direct truth delivered without venom, but with clarity and conviction. Karoline didn't have to yell. She didn't have to insult. She just held up a mirror. And it reflected more than the hosts were ready to see. In that moment, the power dynamics of the show shifted entirely. Whoopi, normally untouchable in her command of the stage, found herself speechless. There was no witty rebuttal, no pivot, No audience to back her up. Just silence and the unmistakable sting of a reality check. The exchange quickly became the centerpiece of viral clips and online debates. Memes were made. Commentators dissected the moment frame by frame. But no amount of analysis could dilute what had just happened live on national television. Karoline had delivered the final blow, and she didn't just win the argument. She exposed the deeper fracture between legacy media and everyday Americans. In less than a minute, she captured exactly why so many have stopped listening to shows like The View. Karoline Leavitt didn't just survive The View, she dominated it. She walked into a hostile arena, stood her ground, and turned the narrative completely on its head. Whoopi Goldberg, usually the unshakable matriarch of daytime TV, was visibly rattled. And audiences across the country saw something they weren't used to seeing: a conservative woman winning on a liberal stage. But what do you think? Was Karoline Leavitt spot on, or did Whoopi hold her own better than we're giving her credit for? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from every side of this debate. If you loved this breakdown, don't forget to smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another fire moment like this one. We've got more political showdowns, behind-the-scenes media insights, and cultural clashes coming your way every week. Until next time, stay bold, stay curious, and don't be afraid to speak truth, even when it's live on national TV. Thanks for watching.